How's it going, everyone? Got a little bit of a different video today. Got some frequently asked questions and different quandaries from various associates, friends, family members of mine. Just trying to figure out what's going on with all of this stuff. So let's go ahead and get into it. First question: do I worship Satan? No. That it's more complicated than no, but I'm not what you typically would refer to as a Satanist. Most people see Satanists as evil, child sacrificing, um, good hating robots, and I don't see myself that way. And I hope none of you do. The reason that gets complicated is what the word Satan means. Satan comes from Hasatan. It comes from the concept of an adversary or an accuser. Now, throughout life, I have started to associate adversity with growth and strength. That's something that I consider to be a focus of mine. Now, does that mean that I worship it? Maybe. But I don't consider myself a Satanist. Next question. What is the difference between the Qliphoth and the Tunnels of Set? The Tunnels of Set are like the highways that connect the cities that are the Qliphoth. That's one way to think about it. Okay, we've got, what are some various trance techniques? Well, drive home after a long day of work. You'll probably be in trance. You shouldn't be because you're driving, but many of us have noticed this proclivity to sort of fall off the focus track whenever we're doing something that's repetitive. And that's the key. Do something that is repetitive, that makes your conscious, intellectual, analytical mind say, what is going on? This is boring. I don't want to think about this. And that's exactly what you want. You don't want the intellectual mind thinking about what you're doing when you're trying to get into trance, when you're trying to do magic, when you're trying to contact the unconscious or subconscious mind. The intellect acts like a sort of gatekeeper, and it says, well, that's not real, that's not true, here's what I think, that's what I know. And a lot of that's not very useful. So some various techniques. We could play instruments like the didgeridoo here, something that's very drone. There's also swaying and rocking back and forth. This is another technique. You can repeat a mantra over and over and over. Here's an interesting one. When I was a kid, I used to find myself constantly tapping myself on the head at school. And I would just zone out, or sometimes I would even tap myself on the bridge of my nose and the whole middle of my face would go numb. And next thing I knew, 88 minutes had gone by and it was lunchtime. Next question. What are some differences and similarities between the Sephiroth and the Qliphoth, and angels of the Shem Hamfarash, and the Goetia? Well, the similarities are that they're siblings. They're mirrors of each other as well. Some more specific instances of examples would be that the Sephiroth are, perhaps you could think about it as our virtues. And the Qliphoth you could think of as vices. But it's not quite perfect. That's just a basic way to understand it. They're imbalances and corrections of one another. The angels I tend to view as imperial, beneficent, higher frequencies. You might associate these with potential, higher potential. You might also attribute them to external sources, whereas the so-called demons you might think of as infernal or internal, or lower aspects that relate to the shadow, the parts of us that are repressed. Why do these practices at all? Well, because they work. I have found that each and every one of us has a different way of doing different things. Some people, when they need to relax, they crack open a cold beer. When some people need to relax, they recline back and they throw on some television. When some people need to relax, they do yoga and practice asanas and mantra and mudras and pranayama, various techniques for relaxing. Some people will go for a walk. Some people will plant flowers or work on their garden. Well, magic is my gardening. It is a combination of all of the techniques that I have found: psychological, energetic, physical, emotional. It's a way for me to unite all of my worlds, all of my theories, all of my practices into one central practice. What are some of my influences? That's a really good question. My influences range from Tolkien to, let's say, let's not go too deep into the fantasy. My influences range from fantasy literature to factual literature. Various sciences like astronomy, chemistry, psychology. I draw inspiration from that. I draw inspiration from art and music and literature. I draw inspiration from my peers, from my fellow artists who are out there. Influence can be found anywhere. I find inspiration in the growing grass. I find inspiration in a budding flower or a chirping bird. I find inspiration in flicking a candle flame and it combusting into something as magical as fire. Things to avoid. Let's start from the beginning. Avoid rushing through things. It can be tempting to move from one thing to the next because our mind gets bored. Or it says, yeah, I get it, I know. We've been doing this for 3 weeks now. Surely there's nothing else I can learn. You're wrong. There's things that I have done for years, like playing an instrument. And all of a sudden, something will be elucidated. A new technique, a new perspective, a new way of looking at things. So take your time. This is not a race. It's better to be a beginner who has a full grasp on the beginning than a so-called adept that just has a very tenuous grasp on everything. When it comes down to it, this is a foundational art. You're only as strong as your foundation. Power isn't everything. I know more than one practitioner who obsessed themselves with power, and that power overwhelmed them because they didn't have the endurance to withstand it or the wisdom to know how to direct it. Take your time. Avoid allowing other people to influence you too much. I've found that this is all a process of remembering as opposed to learning. When you take time for yourself and you get to know yourself and your opinions and your perspectives, a lot of times a pantheon of spirits that you're meant to work with will elucidate themselves to you. You don't need to go and look on this forum or that website or read these books to understand what's going on in your world. Now, that being said, if you're having trouble understanding how you relate to other people, this can be a good time to look at external sources. Just don't obsess yourself with other people's opinions and perspectives. They're a guide. If you start following other people, you're going to get lost. You're going to look around and all of a sudden you're going to say, I don't know where I am and I don't know how to get back to where I want to be. And it's going to take you as much time backtracking as you would have spent traveling your own way. So save yourself some time. Don't rush. Don't concern yourself too much with what other people say. If somebody gives you a tip and it works for you, great. But my advice is to let it work for you in a way that you can then begin to create something for yourself that works for you. And then now we've got 2 techniques for the community as opposed to 1. And now perhaps twice as many people will be benefited. Anything else to avoid? Watch who you talk about. Watch who you talk to about what's going on. This is a common practice, the technique of silence, but it's not just a magical technique. When you talk about what you want to do and what you're doing, your brain's running a simulation, and parts of it can't tell. It can't tell that you didn't actually do that thing because you've convinced it by simulating it that you've done it already. So then it says, okay, that's done. Write that off the list. What's next? It helps with concentration and focus to keep that concentrated and not dispersed into the atmosphere. Concentrate and concentrate. How has the Qliphothic travels differed from the Sephirotic travels? My travels in the Etz Kodesh, or the tree, the holy tree, the tree of life, were very blissful. They were very dreamlike. There was this sense of deja vu constantly. There was this very light air in the atmosphere. It was just very surreal. It was also very gentle and very gradual. I felt like I could stay here, I could go there. There's no pressure. I'm just going to kind of go with the flow, see what's happening. The entities that I experienced there were very kind. They were very compassionate. And they had a certain look and feel about them that was very heavenly, you might say. The Qliphoth, on the other hand, it's a little bit heavier. There's a little bit more pressure. I think about the Qliphoth, the different Qlipha, as gravity zones. The further in you get, the heavier a simple act can be. You might be in the first sphere of Nehemoth or Lilith, depending on your tradition. And you go to do something like the dishes. And one thing after another can get in your way. And it's crazy. Of course it's a coincidence. Everything is a coincidence. But you start getting into the 5th, 6th, 7th spheres. Sometimes waking up in the morning can feel like an act of war. In the same context, the tunnels, they get tighter and tighter and tighter. And you find that there's less of you that can make it down there as you go. It's been my experience. How has this path surprised me, if at all? It's very intriguing to me because when I first started, it wasn't as real as I thought. But now, it is so much more real than I could have ever planned for. And a lot of that has to do with my perspective. When I first started this, I was approaching it from, okay, me, Corbin, I am causing change in the world, and I'm forcing my will upon this circumstance, and it's going to happen, and it would happen to some degree, but it wouldn't always happen to the degree that I thought that it would. And I also thought, okay, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. This name, this is the name of that entity, and this is the image of that entity. The road is the map. The menu is the meal. Nowadays, I have no clue what's going on. I don't know why any of this works. I don't know how it works. I don't know why it works. but it works. It does, and I concern myself less and less these days with why and how and because. I see this as a scientific experiment. Input relates to output, and the more I think about it that way, the more solid the results become, and the more immersive it becomes. I feel less hindered and fettered, not trying to define everything all the time. How else has it surprised me? It surprises me how many practitioners there are. There are practitioners everywhere, and some of them don't even realize the degree that they're practitioners. But I'm always surprised when I'm talking to so and so, and they'll say something like, like focus is a magical thing, and they'll look at you to see if you're alive, and you can sort of reciprocate that, and they'll know. Nothing needs to be said. They'll know, and it surprises me how magical everything is. Everything is just so alive and brimming with magic. It's unbelievable. Where does someone start if they're brand new to the magical practice? Start with controlling your mind. Either start with controlling your mind or start with controlling your body. Different people probably need different things. If you find yourself unable to control your thoughts, then that might be a good place to start. And if that causes you too much strife, then just like a test in school, don't spend all your time on one question. Move on to the next one. Try something else. There's a couple videos on this channel for how to break obsessions, to deal with mental, emotional, and physical obsessions like addictions, depression, etc. But generally, I recommend starting with the mind. Positive thinking, neurolinguistic programming. Imagine the best self that you could be tomorrow. And imagine that person is standing right in front of you. How do they act? How do they speak? What do they do? When a circumstance arises that would bother you, does it bother them? If it does, do they handle it a little bit better? If they do, how? Why? Project this image of yourself better than you are now, right in front of you. And then just behind that, imagine that there's another image of you, just cloaked in white light, like it is your most powerful, positive potential. And understand that every step you take towards the first one is a step you're taking toward the second one. After that, I would begin with breath work. Working with the electric and the magnetic breaths, working with cyclical hyperventilation and things like the Wim Hof method, learning to control your breathing. Your breath has a direct effect on your energy levels, your mindset, your endorphins, neurotransmitters. All of these things are affected by your breathing. Next, after that, comes, if you haven't already, changing your diet, changing your exercise. Take these one step at a time. One step at a time is all it takes. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Okay, last question. Any books that I might recommend? It depends if you want to take an intellectual or an intuitional approach. Let's recommend 3 books. I'll recommend an intellectual, an intuitional, and then one that's sort of in the middle. My intellectual choice is a book called Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. This book just drives an intellectual razor right through the occult, and it doesn't apologize for doing so, nor should it. The intuitional suggestion is The Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune. This one will completely reprogram you. It's very dense. Make no mistakes. It might take you an hour to understand what the first paragraph is talking about. It might not, but it might. If you're new to all of this, you might have no clue what they're talking about. But I promise you, if you stick it out, not only will you learn about the occult, but you'll create a greater sense of adversity. You'll create a greater sense of strength through powering through adversity within yourself. The third book I would recommend is The Red Book by C.G. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung. This marries those two mindsets perfectly. Anyway, that's all for today. I appreciate you watching, and stick around for more.